You keep checking for evidence that you're broken. Scrolling through self-improvement content at 2 in the morning. Measuring yourself against some invisible standard of wellness you can't quite define but know you haven't reached. You're looking for proof of progress in all the wrong places, waiting for the dramatic breakthrough, the moment everything clicks, the day you finally feel fixed. But what if I told you that while you've been searching for signs of growth, you've already been growing? What if the transformation you're desperate to see has been happening in ways so subtle, so quiet, so contrary to what you expected that you've been walking right past the evidence every single day? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching this from, what part of the world you're in as you hear these words. And if something in what I'm saying lands in your chest or your stomach or that tight place in your throat, if you feel that small flutter of recognition, hit that like button. Not for me, but as a signal to yourself that you're ready to see what you haven't been able to see. Share this with someone who needs permission to stop measuring themselves against impossible standards. Subscribe if you want more of these conversations that meet you exactly where you are. You've been performing wellness, curating the right morning routine, saying the right things in therapy, posting the right captions about growth and healing. You know all the language now. You can talk about boundaries and nervous system regulation and inner child work. You've read the books, listened to the podcasts, done the journaling prompts, and still, somehow, you feel like you're failing at healing. Like everyone else got the manual for emotional maturity, and you're still stumbling around in the dark, pretending you know where you're going. You smile when people compliment your progress, but inside you're thinking, if you knew how much I'm still struggling, you wouldn't be impressed. If you could see how often I fall apart in private, you'd know I'm not actually getting better. You measure growth by the absence of pain. You think healing means you should stop feeling anxious, stop getting triggered, stop having bad days. You're waiting to arrive at some permanent state of calm, some elevated consciousness where nothing bothers you anymore. And because you still feel things intensely, because you still react, still struggle, still have moments where you're absolutely certain you haven't learned anything at all, you conclude that you're not growing. You're just going in circles, performing growth while staying fundamentally the same. But here's what you don't see. Here's what's been happening while you've been busy deciding you're not good enough yet. You've started noticing the performance itself. You catch yourself mid-sentence sometimes, hear the slight falseness in your own voice, feel the gap between what you're saying and what you're actually feeling. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, you didn't notice. You just performed, automatically, reflexively, without any awareness that you were translating yourself for other people's comfort. The performance was so seamless you didn't know you were doing it. But now you feel the discord. You're sitting in a conversation and suddenly you're aware that you're saying what you think you should say instead of what you actually think. You're smiling, but you notice the smile doesn't reach your eyes. You're agreeing, but something in your body is saying no. This awareness feels like failure. You think, I'm still doing it. I'm still being fake. I haven't changed at all. But the awareness itself is the change. The fact that you can now detect the gap between your authentic self and your performed self means something fundamental has shifted in your consciousness. You've developed an internal witness, a part of you that can observe your own patterns without being completely consumed by them. This is growth. This noticing is the first stage of transformation, even though it feels like evidence of stagnation. You learn to perform so early you don't remember learning. Somewhere in childhood, you figured out that certain versions of you were acceptable and certain versions were not. Maybe you learned that your anger made people leave, so you became the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who never loses their temper even when they should. Maybe you learned that your sadness made people uncomfortable, so you became the strong one, the one who holds it together, the one everyone else leans on. Maybe you learned that your needs were too much, your feelings too big, your personality too loud, and you made yourself smaller, quieter, more convenient. These weren't conscious decisions. You were a child trying to survive, trying to maintain connection with the people you needed. You did what every human does. You adapted. You became what you needed to become to stay safe, to stay loved, to stay included. And that adaptation worked. It got you through. It protected you from rejection, from abandonment, from the unbearable feeling of being too much or not enough. But adaptations that save us in childhood become prisons in adulthood. The performance that kept you safe at 7 is suffocating you at 37. The mask that protected you then is exhausting you now. You've been running the same program for decades, automatically translating your authentic responses into acceptable ones, and you're so tired you can barely remember what you actually feel underneath all the translation. And then something started to crack. Maybe it was a breakup that forced you to examine how much of yourself you'd been hiding. Maybe it was burnout that made you realize you couldn't maintain the performance anymore. Maybe it was therapy, or a book, or a conversation, or just the accumulating weight of years of self-betrayal finally becoming too heavy to carry. Something broke open, and suddenly you could see the mechanism. You could see how you'd been abandoning yourself over and over in tiny ways and large ways every single day. That seeing felt like devastation. You thought, how did I not know this? How did I waste so much time being someone I'm not? How do I even begin to untangle this? The awareness brought grief, brought shame, brought a kind of existential vertigo. If you've been performing this whole time, who are you really? If you take off the mask, what's underneath? Here's what you don't understand yet. Your nervous system is recalibrating. For years, maybe decades, your system learned that authenticity equals danger. Every time you showed your real feelings and got rejected, every time you expressed a need and got shut down, every time you were yourself and it resulted in conflict or withdrawal or disappointment, your nervous system logged that data. It created a simple equation. Real self equals threat, performed. Self equals safety. And it started automatically choosing performance without your conscious involvement as a survival mechanism. Now you're trying to reverse that equation. You're trying to convince your nervous system that authenticity is actually safe, that you can be real and survive it. That the people who matter will stay even when you stop performing. But your nervous system doesn't trust this new information yet. It's been keeping you alive with the old strategy for too long. So every time you try to be authentic, every time you consider saying what you really think or showing what you really feel, your system floods you with anxiety. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your throat closes, your mind goes blank. This is your system saying, danger, danger, don't do it. Go back to the script, perform, stay safe. And because you feel this fear every time you try to be real, you think you're not growing. You think, if I were really healing, this would be easier. If I were actually changing, I wouldn't still feel so scared. But the fear isn't evidence of stagnation. The fear is evidence that you're pushing against decades of conditioning. You're asking your nervous system to trust something it has learned through painful experience, not to trust. Of course, it's scared. Of course, it's resistant. The miracle isn't that you still feel fear. The miracle is that you're trying anyway. You've started saying no without explaining yourself. Not every time, not perfectly, but sometimes. Someone asks you to do something you don't want to do, and instead of launching into a detailed justification of why you can't, instead of apologizing profusely and offering alternatives, instead of saying yes and then resenting them later, you just say, I can't do that, or that doesn't work for me, or simply no. And then you sit with the discomfort of not softening it, not making it easier for them, not managing their disappointment. This feels terrible. You feel guilty, selfish, mean. You want to take it back to explain, to make them understand that you're not a bad person even though you're saying no. Every fiber of your being wants to go back to the old pattern of over-explaining and apologizing and making yourself smaller so they don't feel rejected, but you don't. You hold the boundary. You let them be disappointed. You tolerate their confusion or their frustration without rushing to fix it. You think this means nothing because you still feel guilty about it. You think real growth would mean saying no easily, without any discomfort, without any fear of their reaction. But that's not how it works. The discomfort is part of the process. You're rewiring neural pathways that have been running the same way for decades. You're teaching your system a new response. Of course it feels wrong. Of course, every cell in your body is screaming at you to go back to the old way. The fact that you're doing it anyway, despite the discomfort, despite the guilt, despite the fear, is the growth. The boundary itself is the evidence, not how it feels to hold it. You've become less interested in being understood. You used to spend hours trying to explain yourself, trying to make people see your perspective, trying to justify your choices and your feelings. You needed them to get it, to validate you, to confirm that you were making sense. Their misunderstanding felt like a threat, like evidence that you were wrong or broken or too much. So you kept explaining, kept trying, kept contorting yourself into clearer and clearer articulations, hoping that if you just found the right words, they'd finally understand. But lately, something's shifted. Someone misunderstands you and you feel the old urge to explain, to fix their perception, to make them see what you really meant. But then something else happens. A small voice inside says, or I could just let them be wrong about me, or I could just let this be unclear, or I could just accept that they're not going to get it, and that's okay. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you listen to that voice. You let the misunderstanding stand. You walk away from the conversation without correcting their perception. You allow them to think whatever they're going to think. This feels like giving up. It feels like you're being passive or avoidant or like you're not fighting hard enough for yourself, but it's actually the opposite. You're finally understanding that not everyone needs to understand you. That you don't need universal validation to know your own truth. That their misunderstanding doesn't actually threaten your reality. You're developing an internal reference point, a sense of self that doesn't require constant external confirmation. This is one of the most profound shifts a human can make, and you're making it without even naming it. Let me tell you about Maya. She's 34, works in marketing, has a close group of friends she's known since college, and from the outside, her life looks exactly like it's supposed to look. But inside, Maya has been drowning. For years, she's been the person everyone comes to with their problems. The listener, the supporter, the one who always has time, who always has advice, who never needs anything herself. Her friends call her their rock. Her family calls her the strong one. And Maya has worn these labels like armor, like proof that she's valuable, that she matters, that she's doing life right. But 6 months ago, Maya's father died suddenly. Heart attack, no warning, here one day and gone the next. And for the first time in her adult life, Maya needed support. She needed to fall apart. She needed someone else to be strong while she was weak. She called her best friend, the one she supported through 2 divorces and a career crisis and countless smaller emergencies. She called her crying, barely able to form words, and her friend said all the right things. Said, "I'm here for you. I love you. You can lean on me." And Maya felt relief, felt like maybe she could actually let herself be held for once. But then the next day, her friend called back, and she needed to talk about her own stuff. Her boyfriend had said something that upset her, and she needed Maya's perspective. And Maya, still raw from her father's death, still barely functional, found herself slipping back into the old role, listening, advising, supporting. Because that's what she does. That's who she is. And her friend never even noticed that Maya had needed something different, that Maya had been asking to not be the strong one for once. Maya hung up that call, and something broke in her. Not dramatically, not with anger or confrontation, just a quiet, internal breaking. A realization that this pattern was going to continue forever unless she changed it. That her friends loved the version of her that served them, but they'd never been asked to love the version that needed things. That she trained everyone in her life to see her as endlessly capable, and now she was trapped in that image. So Maya started doing something that felt impossible. She started telling the truth about her capacity. When friends called with problems, instead of automatically saying, "Yes, I can talk," she started saying, "I don't have the space for this right now." When her sister asked her to help plan their mother's birthday party, Maya said, "I need someone else to take the lead this time." When her colleague asked her to cover a project, Maya said, "No, I can't take that on." And every single time, she felt like the worst person in the world, selfish, cold, failing at the one thing she was supposed to be good at. But then something unexpected happened. Some people got angry, some people pulled away. Her best friend accused her of being distant, of changing, of not being there anymore, and it hurt. It hurt so much Maya almost went back to the old pattern, almost apologized and explained and promised to be better, but she didn't. She let those people be angry. She let them pull away. And in the space they left, something else emerged. A few people stayed. Not many, but a few. And those people started showing up differently. They started asking Maya how she was doing and actually waiting for a real answer. They started offering support instead of just taking it. They started seeing her as a full person instead of a function. And Maya realized, these are my actual friends, the ones who can love me when I'm not serving them, the ones who want reciprocity, not just supply, the ones who were waiting for permission to know the real her. Maya's still figuring it out. She still feels guilty when she says no. She still sometimes slips back into the old role of caretaker and has to consciously pull herself out. She still grieves the friendships that couldn't survive her becoming more honest. But she's different now. She knows the difference between connection and performance. She knows the cost of being everyone's rock. And she's learning slowly, painfully, beautifully to be a human instead of a function. You're having more moments of not knowing what to say. You're in a conversation and someone asks you a question, and instead of immediately producing the right answer, the appropriate response, the thing that will make them comfortable, you just stop. You don't know. You actually don't know what you think or how you feel or what you want. And instead of panicking and filling the silence with something, anything, you're starting to let the not knowing be there. You're starting to say, I don't know, or I need to think about that, or I'm not sure how I feel yet. This feels like regression. You think, I used to be so articulate, so quick, so good at conversations. Now I'm fumbling, hesitating, seeming uncertain. People must think I'm losing it. But you're not losing anything. You're finding something. You're finding the space between stimulus and response, the gap where your actual truth lives. You've spent years responding automatically, saying what you're supposed to say without ever checking in with what you actually think. Now you're pausing. You're creating space. You're waiting for your real response to emerge instead of grabbing the first socially acceptable one. This is what Rogers called the organismic valuing process. Your organism, your whole being knows what's true for you, but you've been overriding that knowing with your mind, with your conditioning, with your fear of disapproval. You've been living from your head instead of your whole self. And now you're learning to wait, to listen, to let your deeper knowing surface. It's slower. It's less smooth. It makes you seem less certain, but it's real. And real is what you've been missing. You've started noticing when you feel drained versus when you feel energized. You used to push through everything with the same determined effort, treating all obligations equally, never questioning whether something was actually good for you or just something you were supposed to do. But now, you're paying attention to your energy. You notice that certain people leave you feeling exhausted, depleted, like you need 3 days to recover from one coffee date. You notice that certain activities, even ones you're supposed to enjoy, feel like obligations you're forcing yourself through. You notice that some conversations light you up and some conversations make you want to disappear. And here's what's different. You're starting to trust these signals. You're starting to believe that your exhaustion means something, that your body's response is valid information, that you're allowed to organize your life around what actually nourishes you instead of what you think you should want. You're not doing this perfectly. You still say yes to things that drain you. You still spend time with people who exhaust you, but now you notice. Now you're aware. And that awareness is creating tiny moments of choice where before there was only automatic compliance. This is your actualizing tendency waking up. There's something in you that knows what you need, that's always known, that's been trying to tell you for years, but you've been too busy performing, too busy meeting expectations, too busy being good to listen. Now you're starting to hear it, that quiet voice that says, "This doesn't feel right. This isn't for me. I need something different." And you're starting to trust it, even when it contradicts what you think you should want, even when it disappoints people, even when it means admitting you've been going in the wrong direction. Let me tell you about James. He's 41, married for 15 years, 2 kids, works in finance. On paper, he's successful, good salary, nice house, stable family. But James has been having panic attacks in his car before he goes into work. Sitting in the parking garage, heart pounding, hands shaking, unable to make himself walk into the building. He's been doing this job for 12 years. He's good at it. He makes good money. It's what he went to school for, what he trained for, what everyone expects him to do. But he hates it. Has hated it for years. Maybe always hated it, but convinced himself he didn't because hating it wasn't an option. James grew up poor. His parents struggled constantly, fought about money, stressed about bills. He watched his father work a job he despised for 30 years because that's what you do. That's what being responsible means. So when James got into a good college, got a finance degree, got a high-paying job, he felt like he'd made it. Like he'd escaped the struggle his parents lived with, like he'd done what he was supposed to do. But the job slowly killed something in him. Every year, he felt a little more numb, a little more disconnected, a little more like he was watching his life from outside his body. He stopped having opinions about things, stopped having hobbies. Came home exhausted and spent his evening scrolling his phone, not really present with his kids, not really present with his wife, not really present with himself. And he told himself this was normal, this was adulthood, this was responsibility. Everyone feels this way. Then the panic attacks started, and James couldn't ignore them, couldn't push through them. His body was screaming at him in a language he couldn't misinterpret, so he started therapy. And his therapist asked him a question nobody had ever asked. What do you actually want to do? Not what you should do, not what makes sense financially, not what your family needs. What do you want? And James had no idea. The question felt absurd, irrelevant, indulgent. What he wanted didn't matter. What mattered was taking care of his family, being responsible, not being like his father who complained but never changed anything. But his therapist kept asking, kept making space for James to not know, to sit with the question, to wait for something real to emerge. And slowly, over months, something did emerge. James remembered that in college, before he switched to finance, he'd been studying environmental science. He'd loved it. Had been fascinated by ecology, by systems, by the way everything in nature was connected. But it didn't seem practical, didn't seem like it would lead to a stable career. So he'd switched majors, convinced himself he was being smart, being realistic, being mature, but that love hadn't died. It had just gone underground, waiting. And now, at 41, having a panic attack in a parking garage, James had to face the truth. He'd been living someone else's life. He'd been doing what he thought he should do instead of what he actually wanted to do, and it had cost him 15 years of vitality, of presence, of feeling alive. James didn't quit his job the next day. He's not reckless. He has responsibilities. But he started taking steps. He started volunteering with an environmental nonprofit on weekends. He started taking his kids on nature hikes, teaching them about ecosystems, letting himself be enthusiastic about something for the first time in years. He started having conversations with his wife about what a different life might look like, what they might be willing to sacrifice financially if it meant he could do work that didn't make him want to die. And the panic attack stopped. Not because his circumstances changed immediately, but because he'd stopped betraying himself. He'd stopped pretending he was fine with a life that was killing him. He'd started listening to the part of him that knew what he needed, even when what he needed was inconvenient, even when it meant disappointing the image of himself he'd been maintaining, even when it meant admitting he'd been wrong about what mattered. James is still figuring out what comes next. He might transition careers gradually. He might find a way to integrate his passion into his current work. He might discover something entirely different. But he's alive now. He's present. He stopped performing contentment and started feeling his actual feelings. And that shift, that simple act of stopping the lie, has changed everything. You're becoming less defensive when someone criticizes you. You used to feel criticism like a physical attack, like evidence that you were fundamentally flawed, like confirmation of your worst fears about yourself. So you defended, explained, justified, argued. You needed them to take it back, to see that they were wrong about you, to restore your image in their eyes. The criticism felt like an existential threat. But something's changing. Someone criticizes you now and you feel the old surge of defensiveness. The old need to explain yourself, the old panic about being seen as wrong or bad. But then sometimes you pause, you take a breath. You consider whether there might be truth in what they're saying. Not because you're trying to be mature or evolved, but because you're genuinely curious, because you're starting to understand that criticism isn't annihilation, that someone seeing your flaws doesn't mean you're worthless, that you can be imperfect and still be okay. This doesn't mean you accept all criticism uncritically. Some criticism is unfair, projection, someone else's stuff that has nothing to do with you, but you're developing the capacity to sort through it, to take what's useful and leave what isn't, without either defending against all of it or collapsing under all of it. You're finding a middle ground between rigid self-protection and complete self-abandonment. This is what it looks like when you start to have unconditional positive regard for yourself. Not unconditional positive regard as in thinking you're perfect, but unconditional positive regard as in you can see your flaws, your mistakes, your limitations, and still maintain your fundamental sense of worth. You don't need to be flawless to be valuable. You don't need to be beyond criticism to be lovable. You can be imperfect and still be enough. You're having more uncomfortable conversations instead of avoiding them. You used to let things build up, let resentments accumulate, let small hurts compound into large wounds because you couldn't bear the discomfort of saying something. You told yourself you were being mature, being the bigger person, not making a big deal out of nothing. But really, you were terrified. terrified of conflict, of their reaction, of being seen as difficult or demanding or too sensitive. But now, you're starting to speak up, not perfectly, not always, but more than before. Someone does something that bothers you, and instead of swallowing it, instead of pretending it's fine, you say something. Your voice shakes, your heart pounds. You might cry or stumble over your words or not articulate it as clearly as you'd like, but you say it. You stop protecting them from your truth. You stop prioritizing their comfort over your honesty. And sometimes it goes badly. Sometimes they get defensive or dismissive or angry. Sometimes the conversation doesn't resolve anything. Sometimes you walk away feeling worse than before, but you're doing it anyway. You're choosing authenticity over peace, truth over comfort, real relationship over performed harmony, because you're starting to understand that relationships built on your silence aren't real relationships. That love that requires you to hide isn't real love. That connection that depends on you never having needs or boundaries or negative feelings isn't real connection. This is terrifying. Because it means you might lose people. It means some relationships might not survive your honesty. It means the version of you that everyone knows might have to die so the real you can emerge. And you're not sure who will stay when you stop performing. You're not sure if anyone will love the real you as much as they love the convenient you. But here's what you're discovering. The people who stay, the people who can handle your honesty, the people who don't need you to be small or silent or easy, those people give you something the others never could. They give you the experience of being loved as you are, not as you pretend to be. And that experience, even with just one person, even in just one relationship, changes everything. It shows you what's possible. It shows you what you've been missing. It shows you why the performance was never worth it. You're spending more time alone and feeling less guilty about it. You used to fill every moment, schedule every weekend, say yes to every invitation because being alone felt like failure, felt like proof that something was wrong with you, felt like loneliness you needed to escape. But now you're choosing solitude. You're turning down plans not because you're depressed or avoiding, but because you genuinely want time with yourself, because you're starting to enjoy your own company, because you're discovering that you need space away from other people's energy to remember who you are. This still feels selfish sometimes. You still worry that people will think you're antisocial or that you're pulling away. You still feel twinges of guilt when you choose a quiet night at home over a social obligation. But you're doing it anyway. You're prioritizing your need for space over your need to be seen as social, available, fun. You're trusting that the people who matter will understand. And the people who don't understand maybe aren't your people. You're learning that solitude isn't loneliness, that time alone isn't time wasted, that you don't need to be constantly connected to other people to prove you're okay. You're developing a relationship with yourself, and that relationship needs tending, needs space, needs quiet. You're becoming someone you actually want to spend time with instead of someone you're constantly trying to escape. You're noticing when you're about to apologize for something that isn't your fault, and sometimes you're stopping yourself. You used to apologize constantly, reflexively, for everything. For taking up space, for having needs, for existing in a way that might inconvenience anyone. Sorry became your default, your verbal tick, your way of making yourself smaller and less threatening, but now you're catching it. You're about to say sorry, and you pause. You ask yourself, what am I actually apologizing for? Did I do something wrong? Or am I just apologizing for being human? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you don't apologize. Someone bumps into you and you don't say sorry. You ask for what you need and you don't apologize for needing it. You take time to respond to a message and you don't apologize for not being instantly available. These feel like tiny rebellions, like small acts of defiance against a lifetime of making yourself small. And they are. You're reclaiming space. You're asserting your right to exist without constant apology. This doesn't mean you never apologize. When you actually do something wrong, when you hurt someone, when you make a mistake, you apologize genuinely and specifically. But you're learning the difference between real apology and reflexive self-diminishment. You're learning that you don't owe the world an apology for being yourself. Here's what all of this means. You're becoming more congruent. That's the word Rogers used, but you don't need the word to understand the experience. You're closing the gap between who you are and who you show. You're letting your inside match your outside more often. You're translating yourself less. You're performing less. You're real more. And it's messy. It's uncomfortable. It's not the smooth, linear progress you thought growth would look like. You still have bad days. You still fall back into old patterns. You still perform, still hide, still betray yourself sometimes. But the trajectory is changing. The direction is shifting. You're moving toward yourself instead of away from yourself, even when it's painful, even when it's slow, even when you can't see it happening. The thing about emotional growth is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fanfare or certificates or clear before and after pictures. It happens in small moments you barely notice. In the pause before you respond. In the boundary you hold even though it feels terrible. In the conversation you have even though you're shaking. In the no you say without explaining. In the truth you tell even though it might cost you. In the moment you choose yourself, even though you've been taught that choosing yourself is selfish. You keep looking for evidence that you're fixed, that you've arrived, that you're finally good enough. But that's not how this works. You're not trying to become perfect. You're trying to become real. And real means imperfect, messy, still figuring it out. Real means you'll always be growing because you'll always be alive. And life keeps presenting new challenges, new edges, new opportunities to choose authenticity over performance. The growth you're looking for is already here. It's in the noticing. It's in the trying. It's in the willingness to keep showing up even when you feel like you're failing. It's in the tiny moments of courage you're dismissing as insignificant. It's in the discomfort you're interpreting as evidence of stagnation when it's actually evidence of change. You're not broken. You never were. You're just a human who learned to hide, who's now learning to emerge. And that emergence doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments so small you can barely track them. But they're adding up. Every time you choose truth over performance, every time you honor your actual feelings instead of your prescribed feelings, every time you let yourself be seen even though you're scared, you're growing. Even when you can't feel it, even when you don't believe it, even when you're sure you're going backward, your organism knows where it's trying to go. Your deepest self knows what you need. And it's been guiding you all along, even when you couldn't hear it, even when you were fighting it, even when you were convinced you were lost. You're not lost. You're finding yourself. And that finding looks like losing yourself first, looks like confusion and uncertainty and not knowing who you are without the performance. Looks like the uncomfortable space between who you were and who you're becoming. Stay in that space. Don't rush it. Don't try to resolve it too quickly. Let yourself not know for a while. Let yourself be uncertain. Let yourself try things and fail at them. Let yourself disappoint people. Let yourself be imperfect and messy and still figuring it out, because that's where the real growth happens. Not in the having it all together, but in the falling apart and choosing to stay anyway. You're doing better than you think. You're growing more than you know, and the fact that you're here reading this, still trying, still hoping, still willing to look at yourself honestly, even when it hurts, that's the evidence. That's the proof. That's the growth you've been looking for, showing up in your willingness to keep seeking it. So stop measuring yourself against some impossible standard. Stop waiting to feel fixed. Stop looking for the dramatic transformation. Start noticing the small shifts. Start honoring the tiny moments of courage. Start seeing the growth that's already happening in ways you haven't been taught to recognize as growth. You're not the same person you were a year ago. You're not even the same person you were yesterday. Every moment of awareness, every choice toward authenticity, every time you honor your truth, even when it's uncomfortable, you're changing. You're becoming more yourself. And that's the whole point. Not to become better, but to become real. Not to transcend your humanity, but to fully inhabit it. Not to stop feeling, but to feel more honestly. Not to stop struggling, but to stop pretending you're not struggling. This is the journey. This is the work. And you're already doing it, whether you can see it or not. Keep going. Keep noticing. Keep choosing yourself, even in the smallest ways. Keep trusting that the discomfort means you're on the right path, not the wrong one. Keep believing that you're worth the effort of becoming real, even when real is messy and imperfect and still learning. You're growing. You've been growing all along, and one day you'll look back and see how far you've come, how much you've changed, how brave you've been in ways you couldn't recognize at the time. Until then, trust the process. Trust yourself. Trust that growth doesn't always look like growth, and healing doesn't always feel like healing. And becoming more yourself sometimes feels like losing yourself completely. You're exactly where you need to be, growing in ways you can't yet see, becoming someone you're going to be proud to know,